The general area of misdiagnosis covers such a wide area. It can involve misdiagnosis of cancer, skin cancer, colon cancer, breast cancer, different kinds of brain cancers. It can involve misdiagnosis of infective conditions, meningitis, different kinds of infections, post-surgical infections, as well as, the entire gamut of medical conditions. Sometimes post-surgical complications which are not properly diagnosed and which could have been taken care of if they had been recognized early on. The issue with misdiagnosis, and this also frequently happens in emergency rooms, where patients come in, for example, with chest pain, and they may be misdiagnosed as having a heartburn or what's known as GERD, which is reflux disease. And it turns out that they have a heart condition. They're either having a heart attack or they are about to have a heart attack. Misdiagnosis of symptoms in emergency departments are very common. For example, in the case of stroke, many times people may come in with symptoms of dizziness, of headache, and they are simply told they have very benign conditions, take a couple of aspirin or Advil, and it turns out that they are either having the beginning of a stroke or are about to have a major stroke and wind up devastated physically and mentally. So these are some of the kinds of misdiagnosis cases you see in the state of New York. And there are principles that involve medical diagnosis that are applicable to these cases and which tend to get violated on a daily basis in the state of New York. For example, the key principle that's applicable in misdiagnosis cases is that physicians who are attempting to diagnose a patient have the obligation to formulate what's called a differential diagnosis after they do an examination, take a history, and do appropriate testing. And what that means is they're obliged to formulate what we would call a list of suspects. It can be this, it can be this, it can be this, it can be this, it can be that. And typically, physicians make the mistake of making the assumption that the most benign condition on that list is what the patient has, because that may be a very common situation that they see. Unfortunately, the medical standard is that they have the obligation to make the assumption that the most serious, dangerous, lethal entity on that list of potential suspects is the one that they should go after first. Make sure first that the patient doesn't have an imminent heart attack, a pulmonary embolism, a dissecting aorta, a meningitis, something that is potentially lethal, before you start saying to the patient, don't worry, this is a common condition, it'll go away on its own, or with a little painkiller or a little medication, don't worry about it. Because that kind of false reassurance can be fatal for a patient. We also see cases in which mammograms are misinterpreted, x-rays are misinterpreted, tumors which appear on x-rays, MRIs, CT scans get missed, and they grow and they become much more difficult to treat. The cancer may spread and kill the patient when an earlier diagnosis may have resulted in a cure or a much greater lifespan for the patient. These are some of the kinds of cases of misdiagnosis we see in the state of New York. And again, the entire gamut of medical conditions can be misdiagnosed. And what we look for is to see whether or not an earlier diagnosis would have made a difference in the patient's life. Because it's not always true. Sometimes the earlier diagnosis would not have helped. But in many cases, an earlier diagnosis would have resulted in treatment or surgery that would have either cured the patient, cut the disease process off, and instead, the misdiagnosis results in that disease process progressing, spreading, becoming worse, and potentially killing the patient.